Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our event, Indigenous Peoples, Biodiversity and Climate, Lessons Learned. I am Carmen None, and I am the director in the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank Group, and it is my pleasure today to moderate today's important discussion. We're here to explore recent evidence on the vital contributions of Indigenous peoples to biodiversity and climate stability, and on the degree to which international organizations are recognizing and empowering these roles. This is the first session of a two-part event that we're hosting. We will begin with a focus on lessons learned, drawing from recent evaluations. And this is virtual. And the second session, which will be in person at the Evidence Pavilion at COP30, will focus on the implications of the evaluative evidence for future strategies and programs. To deliver opening remarks and to set the stage for today's event, I'm delighted to invite our first speaker. Geeta Batra is the director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the Global Environment Facility. Geeta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carmen, and a very good day to everyone. I'd like to start with a simple truth. Indigenous peoples aren't just stakeholders. They are rights holders, knowledge keepers, and frontline climate leaders. They deserve to be in the driver's seat at this COP and beyond. But we're still far from that. Only about 2% of climate finance reaches Indigenous-led organizations directly. And that number tells us just how big the gap is between what we say and what we deliver. That's why COP30 here in Belém, in the Amazon, is such an important moment. If ever there was a time to turn recognition of Indigenous leadership into real measurable action, this is it. And the momentum is building. Leaders here are clearly making it clear that adaptation plans must reflect Indigenous experience, territorial rights, and direct financing. And new efforts like the Tropical Forests Forever facility show what's possible when we value standing forests and ensure that resources actually flow directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities. But progress needs evidence. Evidence built not only through rigorous analysis, but through participatory evaluation that draws on Indigenous knowledge and community-defined outcomes. That's what today's session is about. You'll hear colleagues sharing findings about World Bank's engagement, as Carmen pointed out. Another will highlight where the GCF systems address barriers to Indigenous access. And we'll hear lessons comparing DGM and the Pawanka Fund, two different but very powerful Indigenous-focused financing models. At the GEF, we see this both as a rights commitment and a high-impact climate strategy. Direct access for Indigenous peoples and local communities, recognizing their territories and governance systems is essential to both meaningful adaptation and mitigation. And some of the work we've done at the GEF IEO has clearly shown progress in GEF's engagement with Indigenous peoples, which is crucial for effective climate action. About 1 in 5 small grant projects now involve Indigenous communities directly, helped by practical measures like accepting proposals in Indigenous languages, using participatory video, ensuring Indigenous representation in decision-making. The GEF is also making some progress in the way it identifies Indigenous peoples in project design, but the quality of engagement is still a little uneven and much more needs to be done. So most importantly, our evaluation finds that Indigenous-led projects deliver strong climate results, whether it's from ecosystem restoration to strengthened customary governance. underscoring the power of Indigenous leadership and the need to keep advancing free, prior, informed consent, data quality, and equitable access across countries is an absolute must. So as we gather here today in Belém, the message is very clear. This is the moment to move from acknowledgement to action, to put Indigenous peoples at the heart of climate solutions. With that, thank you, Carmen, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Gita, for your insightful opening. And as you said, time to move from acknowledgement to action. And you pointed out that the momentum that is being building in bringing the experiences of Indigenous peoples into the picture. So now what I like to do is to turn to our presentations, which will offer the evidence from a variety of perspectives on the engagement of different international organizations with Indigenous peoples. On our first presenter, we have Lauren Kelly, Lead Evaluation Officer for Planet at the Independent Evaluation Group, IEG, in the World Bank Group. And Lauren will share key findings from an evaluation of the World Bank engagement with Indigenous peoples in the context of addressing biodiversity loss. Next, we will hear from Ginta Konsi, evaluation specialist, and from Prashad McGill, policy and evaluation specialist, both from the Independent Evaluation Unit at the Green Climate Fund. Their presentation will focus on a recent assessment of the institutional approach of the Green Climate Fund to Indigenous peoples. And last but not least, our final presenter will be Eileen Cunningham, a focal point and a researcher at Wankitangi, a community development organization run by and for Indigenous peoples on Nicaragua's North Atlantic coast. She's also the focal point of the organization under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And she will present a comparative evaluation of two specific instruments designed to support Indigenous peoples, the Grant-Based Mechanism and the Paguanca Indigenous Peoples Fund. With that, I'd like to invite now Lauren Kelly to deliver her presentation. Lauren, thank you. The next 10 minutes are yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Carmen. And thank you also to Gita for her very powerful opening remarks, and welcome everyone. Okay. Thank you so much. As Carmen indicated, we are here today to talk about the role of the World Bank and other international agencies in identifying, empowering, and supporting Indigenous people for the betterment of the earth and society. We are here also to talk about biodiversity because biodiversity and climate change are integrally linked. They're integrally linked because protecting nature and the ecosystems and the regulating services that they provide are critical for stabilizing the climate itself. So the links between biodiversity and climate change are clear, and the role of Indigenous people in protecting nature and therefore stabilizing climate itself is critical and clear. We did in the Independent Evaluation Group an analysis, an evaluation of the World Bank support for biodiversity. We covered a period of 15 years. We had a focus on Indigenous people, recognizing the critical role that Indigenous people play in stewarding the earth. I don't have to tell this audience the role that Indigenous people play. Excuse me one second. In stewarding the earth, IPs manage more than a quarter of the world's land surface. They manage much of the territorial areas that have remained intact, and 1/3 of global intact forests. The research is clear. It shows how forests under indigenous management are less prone to deforestation, including deforestation from agriculture and other industrial uses. We also show in our evaluations that biodiversity, as the research also shows, declines much more slowly in indigenous managed lands, and that these areas are better off. They are better restored and they are better maintained. I also don't have to tell this audience that indigenous lands are under threat due to industrial expansion, climate pressures, and these are compounded by a variety of factors from exclusion from decision making and persistent gaps in legal recognition, land tenure, and a non-recognition of those rights. I'm sorry, I'm sorry that I have to ask something just for the room. Well, I can't see my slides because the pictures of the panelists are on top of them. I apologize for that. Is there any way I can change that, or excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep going, but if you could let me know how to do that, I'd appreciate it. Okay. All right, with no further ado, the evaluation shows, and many evaluations show, how essential it is for the World Bank and other IFIs to identify, empower, and engage Indigenous people. It also shows the importance of protecting Indigenous people when we plan and execute conservation projects. This is because Indigenous people are the most effective stewards of biodiversity, but also because they face disproportionate risks of land loss and exclusion, which then undermines the biodiversity aims of our agencies, but particularly of countries and societies. We show in our evaluation what's possible. We show how the World Bank support in Brazil, for example, the home of this year's COP, can engage in conservation in ways that both protect millions and millions of hectares of land by establishing large, contiguous, connected areas that are essential for ecosystem services and sustainable use, but also by linking Indigenous areas that are well protected, that are well governed, to these conservation spaces, thereby creating a much more sustainable and inclusive conservation plan. And we show the evidence in that in our report, and it's something really to build on and to learn from as we scale. We looked at, in our evaluation, we looked at over 15 years of the World Bank's engagement in biodiversity conservation, and we looked at over 130 projects that support protected areas. We wanted to understand whether and how the World Bank engages Indigenous people when they are identifying, citing, planning, and executing conservation activities in these areas. And what we found is the following: by using global research and maps from initiatives like Landmark and Garnet, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, we found that the World Bank infrequently supports conservation activities both within and adjacent to Indigenous peoples' lands. We also found that when we do this in just a few countries, and I mentioned those countries in the slide here. For example, in Latin America, in Brazil, Colombia, and the DRC, Mexico, Mozambique, Panama, Peru, and Zambia. But that's about it. And that was a stark finding in our evaluation, that there is infrequent engagement when it comes to planning, identifying, and executing these conservation sites, and also that there are a few countries in which we do this in often. Why is this important? It's important because in the beginning of this presentation, I talked about two factors. I talked about the role that Indigenous people play in stewarding the world's biodiversity and the world's remaining forests, the intact land that's critical for ecosystem services. And I also talked about the way that these lands are under threat from exploitation, from rights exclusion, and other factors that undermine their ability to support biodiversity protection and those advancements. And here what we see is a further piece of research that we conducted on what we call our safeguards. These are the policies in place in our organization and other organizations that make sure that our projects do no harm. And what we showed in our evaluation is that we are less apt, we are less frequently protecting Indigenous people by less frequently engaging them in our conservation activities over time. The chart shows you that in the first 5 to 7 years of our evaluation period, 2010 to 2015, we were more likely and largely more likely to cover Indigenous peoples in our conservation activities than we are more recently. And that matters for being able to identify these risks and protect these communities from harm. Another stark finding, another important finding, and we'll talk about the development grant, the dedicated grant mechanism in this presentation. We have a presentation that will cover that. But another critical finding in our evaluation concerns Indigenous people in Africa. And what we found is that, and again, I don't have to tell this audience what they already know, but that African Indigenous people are at the forefront of advocating for climate justice here at the COP today, this week. They are there because they disproportionately experience the negative impact from climate change, and they are demanding critical rights and critical rights that have to do with their land tenure, land security, the ability to be at the driver's seat at the table when making decisions about planning land management and forest management activities. So the dedicated grant mechanism is a mechanism that was developed purposely to do this, to direct finance to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And it has supported bottom-up approaches that have been effective in many ways, particularly to achieve locally led climate adaptation. But as I believe the speaker today will show, results sometimes have been mixed on deeper and more systemic issues that are required to achieve biodiversity and climate action, including for land security and reduced deforestation, which have not always been achieved at a more systemic level. And these more systemic issues have to be addressed if we're going to achieve biodiversity and climate action at scale. And I say this because we've reviewed all of the dedicated grant mechanism activities supported by the World Bank, and we see that roundabout in every region except for Africa, we have used our safeguard policies, whether it was the former regime, the current regime, to identify, empower, and protect Indigenous people. But these policies have not been used in Africa. And so I do think that when we look forward to supporting more direct finance to Indigenous peoples, and particularly the commitments that have made through the Tropical Forest Facility, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, and the dedicated grant mechanism in the future, these issues can be taken up. I have 2 or 3 more slides, and then I'll pass it back to the chair. The reason why we are focusing on many of these aspects of biodiversity, climate change, and Indigenous people is because of the risks that are posed to Indigenous people when international financial organizations engage in biodiversity action that leads to better climate stability, adaptation, and mitigation. And the second thing that we found in the same review on the World Bank safeguards is that the lion's share, 84% of our conservation projects, do apply policies related to involuntary resettlement and land acquisition. So if conservation requires, frankly, the work on involuntary resettlement, which does not always mean moving people, but a change in access to resources and access to land and water and land acquisition, then indeed we must pay special attention. We must focus on understanding concerns and grievances about potential risks and managing those risks ex ante and in real time. All in all, we believe there are 2 to 3 main factors why that we have seen limited engagement of IPLCs and World Bank conservation activities. And I think this is something that probably will resonate with other actors in the donor community. And that is that because of the way that we engage in our project planning processes and siting decisions and risk management decisions, that we are more apt to work with groups that have existing legal recognition of their land and resources, whether that's on collective land mostly, so that those resource rights and land rights are recognized by national law. And that phenomenon helps us. That phenomenal helps us to, I think, manage risks, and that's clear, but it also limits our ability to engage more widely and more at scale. And so some of these exclusion issues that have to do with siting choices and targeting are also associated very much ex ante with perceived risks. And these perceived risks have to do with managing free and prior informed consent and the need to amplify and strengthen the skills and experience with conducting FPIC processes with Indigenous people, considering also the history that many of our agencies have with these issues with our inspection panels. I'll end by saying that the World Bank, IEG, and the World Bank have both made a recommendation and agreed to act. And this is something that I think the World Bank takes very seriously, having agreed to IEG's recommendation. And IEG's recommendation has said very boldly that the World Bank should engage, empower, and protect Indigenous people. And then we have noted many different ways that our agency can do this better, both by internalizing and raising awareness about the role that Indigenous people play as effective stewards of biodiversity. And that's because one of the findings of our work is that awareness needs to be raised amongst people that are not Indigenous peoples or social development experts, but people that manage everything from infrastructure to mining, etc. So people that are not aware of the role they play in advancing biodiversity aims, enhancing the identification of Indigenous people, and that has a lot to do with more contextual understanding of people and their places and their rights, strengthening those rights, and that has a lot to do with the design of our projects, and enhancing collaboration, partnerships, and cooperation between our teams. Again, those teams that understand and recognize the role of Indigenous people, environmental teams, and other project managers, economists, and of course, all importantly, our clients. So with that, I welcome you to peruse, take a look at our IEG evaluation called Biodiversity for a Livable Planet, where we also have put here the link to our work. And I thank very much again the speakers today for joining, and I wish everyone a successful COP.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that great presentation, and you have set the stage very nicely. Now I would like to pass it to both Ginta and Rishad, and you have the next 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thanks, Carmen. Good evening from the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund in Songdo, South Korea. My name is Rishabh Modgil. I'm the Policy and Evaluation Specialist for the fund, and I'm pleased to present the independent evaluation of GCEP's approach to Indigenous peoples, the IPs. This evaluation is situated within a broader climate finance context, in which IPs are largely recognized as essential custodians of ecosystems and climate resilience, yet remain largely excluded from direct access to international resources, and in this case, to international climate finance. In 2018, the GCF adopted its Indigenous Peoples policy, which I will refer to as the policy, articulating commitments to Indigenous rights, traditional knowledge systems, and principles of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. And in this evaluation, we undertook the review of the implementation of GCF's IPs policy. We used mixed methods and undertook 5 country case study visits to Botswana, Colombia, Paraguay, Vanuatu, and the Philippines. I'm pleased to confirm that all recommendations made in this evaluation were adopted by the GCF board earlier this year. I am now going to present selected findings, while my colleague Genta will then present the recommendations. To begin, next slide, please. To begin with, the GCEF's approach towards IPs is defined primarily by the policy and supported by environmental and social safeguards. We found that the GCEF's policy is widely regarded for many of its strengths. We concluded that the GCEF's safeguarding policies are broadly aligned in intent towards IPs, but inconsistent terms and concepts can undermine how the IPs are considered. The policy is currently not fully integrated into the GCF's safeguarding policies suite, which may lead to inconsistent application during appraisal of projects. Importantly, the GCEF's approach to IPs is perceived primarily as a compliance exercise, rather than an opportunity to harness the contribution of IPs in implementing climate actions and achieving meaningful results. We found that the policy's compliance-driven approach can create disincentives for GCF's partners from developing meaningful projects involving IPs, potentially leading to exclusion of IPs from GCEF projects. Next slide, please. Yep. Thank you. On GCEF projects, the evaluation found that the fund's overall approach towards IPs focuses on two key areas: preventing harm through safeguards and promoting information sharing, participation, and consultation. While commendable, this approach lacks a clearly defined commitment to providing IPs with specific access or resource benefits. Also, GCEP projects are expected to focus on national level or country priorities. Its government-centric and accreditation-based model presents a systemic challenge to IPs accessing climate finance, including the fund's resources directly. External evidence suggests that IPs can cost-effectively and sustainably achieve mitigation and adaptation results for us. Yet, the GCF, being the world's largest climate finance fund, is the only major multilateral climate fund without a specific mechanism or commitment to support IPs. Next slide, please. When we looked into the implementation of GCF's 128 IPs relevant projects as of 2024, we found that the IPs policy and other strategy and policy decisions by the board encourage integrating traditional knowledge into GCF financed activities where suitable. However, we find that applying this knowledge depends on time and resources available to GCF partners. When utilized, this knowledge enhances project relevance and sustainability. As the fund lacks portfolio level commitments focusing on IPs, its monitoring and results measurement systems do not track specific IPs related indicators, making it challenging to assess fund-wide results regarding IPs. We also looked and assessed co-benefits in this evaluation. The GCF's monitoring framework does not mandate tracking or reporting co-benefits specifically related to IPs, resulting in the fund missing the opportunity to assess and understand the broader impacts of its funded projects on IPs. The scope of co-benefits currently remains limited to design, approval, and monitoring phases. When we looked into gender considerations, the evaluation positively found a general alignment of GCF policies on gender. We found that Indigenous women are not systematically targeted by IPs relevant projects. The participation of Indigenous women is limited to capacity building efforts, not amounting to proactive empowerment. Next slide, please. There are so many findings that I want to go over, but because of paucity of time, I'm going to wrap up the findings presentation with this slide. We looked into factors affecting GCF's approach to IPs. I should state here that some of the issues highlighted here are not just unique to GCF alone. These are challenges that are generally faced when programming with IPs. Here we find that while the GCF's IPs policies application is broad in scope, its implementation is rooted in and subject to the national context, where the GCF does not play a proactive role. Consequently, the policy's implementation is highly variable and falls outside GCF's direct sphere of influence. Lastly, and crucially, when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent as a principle, the evaluation found that the GCF's policy frames the use of FPIC as a generally well-intentioned iterative process. We see that as a big positive. In practice, however, we find that FPIC is limited by the scope of its application, timing in project origination, where one can view FPIC as a one-off event rather than a continuous process, and on the lack of availability of resources to support good faith negotiations expected at a GCF standard. With this, I conclude my presentation on findings here. Please shoot any question that you have towards us. I will now pass the floor to my colleague Genta, who will now present the recommendations made in this evaluation, which were adopted by the GCF board earlier this year. Over to you, Genta, take it away.
Thank you, Rish, and hello, participants. I have the difficult task to make this very fast, even if these recommendations were very important, and I think they were very they were a crucial input of these evaluations. I think it's important to maybe just go through them and try to give a gist of what the recommendations are about. So we do have 5 recommendations in total. Recommendation 1 talks about the operational aspect of the policy. So to ensure that the IP's policy achieved its intended objective, it's important that, similar to what the World Bank as well found, we raise awareness across all the GCF partners in terms of the policy, but also to leverage on their strength and knowledge around the Indigenous peoples. Of course, another important activity here would be to update and improve and make more practical the operational guidelines and tools. I think this is something that this is a common, I guess, issue across this type of policies that need constant updated operational documents. And then an important, I think, recommendation here also relates to making the policy always up to speed with what are the normative priorities in terms of the indigenous peoples dialogue and normative prerogatives that are happening globally. Recommendation 2 focuses more on the GCF Secretariat per se, so what GCF needs to do in terms of financial capacities, internal capacities to ensure an adequate implementation of this policy. And here we did find critical creating an enabling environment for indigenous peoples through our funding proposals and further integration of IPs in our documentation, in our strategies, programming, and most importantly, to advance the IPs or particularly pay attention in contexts where indigenous peoples policy cannot be implemented due to preceding national legislation. Also modalities such as readiness, probably as you must have heard about it, or the project preparation facility. These are all modalities that can be utilized to support and address IP's needs. Recommendation 3 talks about how to go beyond compliance. So we did find the policy to be highly compliant, but that doesn't necessarily translate into results. So within the business model of GCF, as you probably know, GCF is a second level due diligence organization. We do recommend GCF to reinforce its oversight by enhancing information that is relevant to IPs, especially in reporting, monitoring, and evaluation. Build capacities institutionally to monitor compliance. Also to strengthen the role of Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group in terms of project reviews, monitoring, and evaluation, and increase the alignment between compliance mechanism the organization has and its monitoring tools and frameworks. And finally, to enhance grievance mechanism at all levels of the organization. And recommendation 4 speaks about the window. I think this is something that is a crucial recommendation that GCF also, the GCF Secretariat has taken on board and is working towards its implementation. So we did find that it is important for IPs to have a specific window or program within the GCF business model. And this particular window should be developed by dedicating a portion of GCF resources to IPs to customize the business model by leveraging, among other things, also the Indigenous Peoples organization contributions and experiences and knowledge, as well as to strengthen the IP or culture within the organization, as well as within the GCF ecosystem of partners, as well as to develop a paradigm shift within this funding windows that deliberately means benefits for IPs. And finally, to wrap everything up, so this base recommendation 5 speaks to the lack of a clear or strategic positioning or clear deliberate approach for Indigenous peoples in GCF. So we do recommend GCF to be more flexible when it comes to prescribing in terms of what are the guidelines, operational tools that accredited entities and partners should have in place in order to effectively implement the IP's policy. Also, GCF should clarify its role when it comes to how much and to what extent it intends to support IPs and their institutions, as well as to GCF to continue set its position for standards or as a trendsetter when it comes to good faith negotiations, engagement, empowerment of IP, and the overall IP's dialogue across the globe. And finally, for GCF to explore its role and potential for creating an enabling environment for IPs that meaningfully engage them throughout the project cycle. And I will stop here. I would also recommend you to look at our evaluation, which is published in the IU website. And we look forward to discuss this evaluation with you all. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you, and also for connecting so late from Korea. And now, last but not least, I want to pass it to Eileen. The next 8 minutes are yours.
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it's really an honor to share with all of you the reflection from this comparative evaluation of these two mechanisms that move through different landscapes, but the idea of both of them is the same, looking for indigenous people autonomy, resilience, and justice. We carry out this evaluation that is innovative in climate finance, comparative evaluation of the dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous people and local communities and the Pawanka Indigenous People Fund. The study compared these two pioneering models, the DGM that was created inside a multilateral system, and also the Pawanka Fund that was created and governed entirely by indigenous people. And both of these financial mechanisms speak a language that is looking for the participation of community, but also both reveal how climate finance can evolve. The idea of this evaluation is to answer a question of what those indigenous led climate finance look like on the ground, what work, what is failing, and why, and to have also lessons to help us to reshape the global climate finance system and align more the system to the indigenous people governance and territorial realities. So what do we found in this evaluation? First of all, we found that indigenous people resilience is a holistic resilience. It's not only technical. It involves cultural, territorial, spiritual, political, and ecological resilience. And yet the climate finance framework are still built around metrics that fail to capture the depth of indigenous people resilience. Where global funds are looking for continuity of project for indigenous people, this is the way of life in the territories. And the other thing that we found was direct access is the strongest driver of success. When indigenous people control the decision-making process, we have seen faster, more relevant, more sustainable, and more deeply rooted in community priority action. So decision-making power is a decisive factor in this process. And it's not only talking about the volume of the funding. Third, we have found that DGM is a breakthrough, but still the autonomy remains partial in DGM. DGM is really it's an innovative mechanism because it's an indigenous-led national steering committee that governs the mechanism. There are more than 400 community initiatives that were supported, and the governance, the monitoring, and the national engagement strengthened significantly the indigenous people structure. But then we see that there are procedure, timelines, reporting, fiduciary system, and safeguard that still are defined under the World Bank. And these are external to the communities and the territories. So even the communities decide what to fund, but not how the mechanism is operating. And this is meaningful because also put some constraint to the reality of the community. And then when we see Pawanka in deep, we saw a financial mechanism that represent a full indigenous people-led financing Pawanka is aligned with indigenous governance from start to finish, where they prioritize the way of life of indigenous at territorial level. They have flexible funding, cultural indicator, relational accountability, and deep territorial work. But also they have some challenge related to the scale, to the predictable long-term funding. But we saw also that they have been strengthening a deep sovereignty and transformation in the communities. The other finding that we had is about the bureaucracy, that is one of the main barriers in this process of financial mechanisms, because we heard from Genta and from Rashid about the bureaucracy in the Green Climate Fund. Well, it's similar also in other financial structure, where there is complex procedure that force the community to adapt to the system instead of the system adapting to the communities. And this also reduce the impact and discourage the participation of the communities and the indigenous people. Also about sustainability is also, we see that it remains the weakest link in climate finance. Neither the mechanism has long-term predictable funding, but true resilient, territorial, cultural, the intergenerational require continuity. And we have seen that most of the time we have only these short time project cycles. And one of the important issues here, I think that we have to raise, is these two financial mechanisms are complementary. They're not competing. We don't see it like that. We see DGM as a bridge that opens the space within the institution, that build technical and political capacity of the indigenous people. And then we see Pawanka as an anchor that ground the climate action in cultural continuity and also in the self-determination of indigenous people. We consider that DGM integrate and Pawanka transform the process. One go to a scale and the other go deeper in the process. And the idea here is that we should find a way that these two mechanisms and other similar can work together to have a more sustainability and deep impact in the community. So for us, I think we bring to this scope one message from this study. Climate finance must adapt to indigenous people way of life, not the other way around. This means that adapting should include indicator, timelines, governance structure, definition of risk. That is very important because we have different views, and also an accountability framework. So how are we going to structure this in the future? And for us, we have like 6 recommendations. I'm going to bring only 3 here. One is create, and I think is similar to the IEU evaluation, is create indigenous windows in the major climate fund with real governance powers of indigenous people and not only one-time consultation, no? The other is about adopt flexible patient financing that is aligned with the rhythm of the territories, the season, the ceremonies, the intergenerational process that are very important, and the support at long term of indigenous-led funds like Pawanka are a essential pillar of the global climate finance. So we think that innovating in climate finance should not be only like a technical issue, should be looking all this relationship, all the cultural issues and political issues inside the territories. It means that when we there is a sorry for my English today, redistribution of the power. We also can elevate the indigenous people system knowledge. We can also ensure that the climate action are going to have a deep impact in the territories. So we think that DGM and also Pawanka are two different paths, but they cover and a broader area of the territories. And it's a way that looking how to work together, they can have a more strong and more just action for indigenous people and territories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. This was fantastic. And to get your point of view, it was really enlightening. And now what I like to do is to thank all the presenters for sharing such a valuable insights and evidence. And we're going to be opening the floor in a little bit for questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat. We already have a question. But before we do that, I want to move to a lightning round. And I'm going to be asking each of the presenters a question. And I will really ask you, if you don't mind, to be less than a minute in answering, because we need to be finishing in 15 minutes so people can move to the next event. And the question is the following. Imagine yourself that you're in an elevator at the COP there in Belém, and in the elevator you have assembled heads of the climate funds and the MDBs, the multilateral development banks. And it's a big elevator with very good acoustics. And based on the evidence that you have presented today, what will be your elevator pitch? Again, please keep it super concise to a minute. And perhaps let me start with Ginta, then I'll pass to Eileen, to Lauren, and last one, Risha. So over to you guys. Go for it.
I'm the first? Yes?
Yes, go ahead,
Okay.
Ginta.
For me would be that the IP's approach to work needs more than just a strong policy. A policy is a great framework. It really helps to set clear direction for the organization, but to make a policy work meaningful for IPs, not only to avoid do no harm, but also to ensure that do good, it needs more than just what we already have in place. It needs more deliberate action within the organization, within the partnerships, resources, capacity building. And I said, again, I think a stronger culture of supporting IPs within the organization. So organization needs to be more and more serious about this policy implementation.
Thank you, fantastic. Eileen, over to you.
I will say that our evaluation of the DGM and the Pawanka Fund have shown a clear pattern. Indigenous-led finance have delivered strong and more sustainable results than traditional model for indigenous people in the territories. That also have to be clear that the barriers are not about capacities, it's about procedures, it's about the lack of trust. And we have to change that vision. And what it works for indigenous people is direct access, flexible and creative rules, and long-term indigenous-led funding. And I think if the MDBs and the financial mechanisms want real impact, I think climate finance need to adapt to indigenous people governance in the other way around. We should do a dialogue of knowledge between indigenous people and the MDBs and the financial mechanisms. Thank you.
Great. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much. If I was in an elevator with a head of office, I would, and particularly in my organization, the World Bank, I would first emphasize that when the World Bank wants to do something, when it wants to get something done, it gets it done. So a lot of the things that we put forward in terms of our corporate mission, whether it's climate action, whether it's our gender strategies, our disaster risk reduction policies, we have overachieved in many of these spheres. So I think what's lacking with Indigenous people is, I think Eileen, you said it well, this not just trust, but knowledge, the research, the understanding that if you're going to pursue nature-based solutions, if you're going to achieve poverty reduction on a livable planet for the bank's mission, then the solution is right there. We have these solutions that have been offered by Indigenous people for millennia. We have the Indigenous knowledge. And I think what I would say very profoundly is that we need to raise awareness and increase the knowledge throughout the World Bank Group on the potential of Indigenous people to achieve biodiversity and climate goals. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, Lauren. And Rizat, what about yours?
Carmen, the core challenge that the IPs face is directly accessing climate finance through the MDBs and IFIs. These are one of the core issues that the IPs are arguing as we speak in Belém, that is for direct access. And if you look at the GCF, its funds are only accessible to accredited institutions with high fiduciary standards, where funding eligibility requires government endorsement and a track record of implementing large projects. This criteria is so restrictive that small Indigenous peoples organizations, the IPOs, are systematically excluded. While rooting climate finance through strong institution builds donor trust, these strong institutions become the intermediaries, excluding direct access for IPOs and trusted partners to directly manage or leverage on the finance pool that is created for the IPs. Carmen, my evaluative judgment based on evidence gives me the confidence to say this, that the MDBs and IFIs need to take the risk. They need to take the plunge, as I call it, to trust the IPOs and CSOs to be able to directly program with them, where they act as conduits to channel climate finance directly to the IPs. And that's why we at the IU recommended the GCF to customize its business model in order to work directly with the IPOs, which should leverage the social capital and the intermediary role of trusted IPOs and relevant organizations engaging the IPs to the extent possible. We recommended to the board that to make a customized model that should leverage the existing capacities of IPOs or other trusted partners with a proven track record, establish trust and prerequisite experience in working with specific IPs communities. I believe in trusting the IPs and their partners for them to be able to handle the finance pool that was created for them would be a good start. Cheers.
Thank you so much. And all of you were so articulate that I'm sure the heads of the climate funds and the MDBs in that elevator will have got the point with your elevator pitches. So great. Now I want to pass to some of the questions that we have received through the chat. We have about 7 more minutes. So let's see how many of them we can cover. The first one was about, it was a question about, could you explain why you think Indigenous peoples can be trusted? And that question came for Lauren. So I'm going to ask you, Lauren, if you could answer it. But I also like to ask Eileen to answer that question. So over to both of you.
Thank you so much. I hear that question, and I think it's a matter of what we've been saying in this event. I think it's about knowledge and awareness about what's been achieved by Indigenous peoples groups. And I think it has a lot to do with the way evaluations, and we don't do enough of them, can showcase the evidence, can showcase outcomes and measurable outcomes in the space. And what we showed in our evaluation is that, and I think there's a plentiful bit of research on that, right, is that Indigenous managed lands, including in Africa, have equal or lower deforestation rates than many state-run areas, often with better biodiversity outcomes because management aligns with long-term cultural stewardship rather than short-term political cycles. I mean, we see this, we've documented this, et cetera. I also said that we have, frankly, limited experience because of the infrequent engagement. And so I think to move up the trust quotient, I think let's take the plunge, right, as Ritop said, and let's move on from what has worked and scale and achieve those biodiversity and climate benefits that are so needed. I also want to say one more thing. I think what hasn't been said today is that there's very low awareness very low awareness, I think, within the organizations and globally of the fact that we've reached critical tipping points. And I think our organizations are saying, okay, if we've reached these critical tipping points that have to do with ecosystem loss, land degradation, and climate instability, if we've reached this, then we need solutions. And I think what we're saying in this panel as well is that where the evidence points to those solutions with regard to the role that Indigenous peoples and local communities play, then we should learn more, do more to be able to scale the solutions well. Thank you, Carmen.
Eileen, go ahead.
Just to build a little bit more of what Lauren said, I don't think it's about that we are asking of trust based on promises. I think you have seen the result of Lauren evaluation and also on other studies that can show that Indigenous people earned the proven result through decades of living in the territories. We just finished also, this is a part, but we just finished a global data study about Indigenous people action in adaptation, and we have more than 700 examples of how Indigenous people are doing adaptation in their territories. Also how Indigenous people are managing the funds in a very transparent and accountability way. And I see what Lauren said. We need to work together. It's not about trust or not trust. We are in a point of inflection right now, and we need to look the different approach to really have a good outcome of all these climate crises. Thank you.
Fantastic. And then the last question we can take is the following. What might look like for independent evaluation units, including non-Indigenous evaluators in development organizations, to explore and embed Indigenous evaluation sincerely in evaluation work related to Indigenous peoples? So I like to ask perhaps either Ginta or Risa to answer that one in a couple of minutes, please. Thank you.
Now, that's a very pertinent question. In our evaluation, and we did mention our methodology, we had a close collaboration with Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, providing inputs throughout the design of the evaluation, the terms of reference, the questions. So that was an interesting collaboration that we maintained throughout the evaluation, including local consultants that were parts of Indigenous peoples groups in the countries that we visited. That was the extent we could engage with Indigenous peoples within this evaluation, also as constrained by time limitations, resources, and as you know, the urgency of delivering these evaluations. So we did try to include and to have this participatory. Indigenous evaluation methodologies were also in our radar, and we did include them to the extent possible within the theory of change. And we did try to address, some of the questions using these methodologies. But again, this is something for us to really think seriously and have it considered much more strongly in the next evaluation. I definitely think that's something that it was somehow a limitation, but that we try to address to the extent possible. Thank you.
Maybe I can add to that.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. There will always be a big limitation when we do Indigenous evaluation sitting at HQs on the desk. An evaluation is mostly a desk-based exercise, but to undertake and get authentic, meaningful data, you have to go on the field. Also, another element can be inclusion. While we tried our best sitting at our desks with the checklists that we're given to include Indigenous participation in the evaluation, so the evaluation process itself becomes an act of inclusion, our hands are tied with all the limitations. So the best of the ability that we can take to make this process inclusive by including IPs when we go on field visits would be another good start, but to always be very mindful of the limitation that to deploy the Indigenous evaluation frameworks in limited times of an evaluation which has to finish from end to end within 6 months is not possible. So just to be mindful of the fact and that we keep our hearts open to always try to make this inclusive, and we try to go outside our HQs on the field. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this is a good way to wrap up and connect it to what Gita said at the beginning. Let's ensure we can keep the momentum to bring Indigenous peoples into the picture of evaluation with urgency and inclusion, as you guys just mentioned now. Thank you again to Gita for the great opening remarks, to all of the speakers for the enlightening contributions, and to everyone. We had over 60 people connected, participating in today's session. And now we invite you to join us for the next session, where we will explore the implications of recent evidence for future strategies and programs. Again, this session is going to be in person at the Evidence Pavilion at CAP 30 over there in Belém. And then there will be a 15-minute, there's going to be a 15-minute coffee break now before that one. Again, for those joining remotely, please use the link posted in the chat, and we look forward to continue the conversation with you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to the
Thank you.
panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.